Why don't we start with this? Just sort of a little intro and also maybe just a few comments on what really is driving this whole CXO sort of specific strategy.
I specialize on capability centers, outsourcing, advisory, insourcing, service delivery model transformation. And one of the anchors of my work with executives like you is advising them on how they can better position their technology groups or organizations, primarily in nearshore locations and also offshore locations. With that being said, this is my 25th year doing that. So it has been a long run so far. And I think there is a lot of interest these days on nearshore again, right? Started probably the wave in 2000 with the first wave of capability centers, captive centers at the time, or global delivery centers. It was all about cost optimization. Today, what we see in the marketplace is that the industry was dormant and in a way of not setting up capability centers or captive centers. It was more about outsourcing. But today, we see a lot of interest from clients on setting up or improving their capability centers. And the main driver is attraction of people, like skills, getting new skills, and accelerating transformation of their organizations, IT, finance, HR. So that's what we see driving the market right now, is access to talent, accelerate transformation, enhancing the ways of working, like including agile, DevSecOps, those type of approaches, but also transforming the way that those capability centers influence the business strategy, being more agile, more rapid to the market with new products, creating the right talent pools, follow the sun model, again, back in town. So those are like high-level drivers that we see happening in the and the conversation that are driving in the C-suite primarily.
My journey started, let's say, 20 years ago or so. It was early 2000s. I was working for Home Depot, and we started outsourcing, offshoring, primarily in India. I kind of took that forward. We separated HD Supply, carved out of Home Depot. I don't know if you guys remember that. And any of you remember that HD Supply was a wholesale distribution arm of Home Depot. So when we separated out, we need to have more of an elastic model for talent, for engineering talent specifically in our IT shop. So I started leveraging India and some partners there. Fast forward a few years, a couple of different models that I thought that we went through that were great was just traditional staff aug, and then that evolved into managed services. We never went captive, never went through a BOT process. But then recently, Chris and I worked together at Zego, and we had an opportunity. We bought a company that had primarily outsourced all their talent, all their engineering talent. And when we were acquired, when Zego was acquired by Global Payments, we had the opportunity to create a captive in India, which we did, and that went really well. So we leveraged a model where we had elasticity, but more access to engineering talent on demand by leveraging partners offshore and then eventually nearshore, in addition to captive in India. And so now where I am, I see an opportunity because of all the talent nearshore and the time zone alignment. You get better productivity, you get better alignment from a team standpoint. You can have teams that are, in this virtual world that we're living in right now, as long as they're close in time zones, you get better alignment, you get better productivity, and then the availability of skills near shore. It's phenomenal. The growth and development of engineering talent in near shore has allowed us to really expand more quickly. The cost of talent's, of course, less than it is in the U.S. It's easier. It seems to be easier to find the skill sets that are in demand for us, so we can leverage. Let me just say that we're we don't have a captive, but we're leveraging a BOT process so that we can get to that. I think that there's a good opportunity to have both a captive as well, like a center of excellence, as well as leveraging partners near shore to create that elasticity.
At the time, I was working in environmental remediation, and we had India offshore developers. And at the time, and you probably recall, I started reading about Nearshore. And every time I would say the word Nearshore, people would be like, I'm sorry, you misspoke. What was that word again? And we're to the point now, I don't encounter that at all anymore. But it was 100% of the time. I mean, nobody knew the word Nearshore. I think we were the only two people in on the secret. What we did, so I wanted to explore it. So we did an experiment at the time where India has incredible rates. If you, and it certainly did at the time. And if you looked at the pricing and you had to run it through accounting, and accountants were the final sayer, they would tell you to go to India at the time for many, many years, and possibly even today. But there's a lot of overhead with being so asynchronous with software development. I mean, you're throwing it over a fence and coming back the next day to look at what has done versus a very collaborative environment. So if you were agile, agile requires, in my opinion, collaboration. And it requires not just the collaboration of engineers on the same team, it requires collaboration with product owners, with ultimately salespeople, everybody who has a stake in what you're developing. So what we did at the time, which was for me the big confirmation of Nearshore, we did a study of the results. We had two products. For those of you who are old, there was an old way of measuring. It was often used in estimation called Kokomo, functionality within an application. And so we looked at the end result, which takes into account churn. So very simple math. You have somebody that is $10 an hour and it takes them 2 hours to get something done versus somebody who's $20 an hour that takes 1 hour to get it done. Those are even, with the exception of a frustration level. And we did this, and nearshoring, which was more expensive, turned out to be more expensive on the hourly basis, noticeably, turned out to be quicker to get things into productivity. And so not only do you have the fact that it was cheaper to develop with Nearshore, you also have time to market, and time to market is revenue impacting. So I did a pretty detailed study at the time, and it really sold me on Nearshore.
Into the enterprise, executive level, the whole sort of willingness to endorse a captive strategy. It's really two big questions, right? It's the idea of just doing a captive, number one, and then nearshore. So, addressing those two questions, how do you guys feel? How is that conversation? You guys have been around a few years now. If you had brought that conversation up 15 years ago, how is it different than today?
I think that part of it is the how. Like I think it is becoming more common and more accepting to create captives, centers of excellence near shore. But the question becomes, how do we get there? Because it's really easy to fail if you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the employment laws and all of the locations that you're wanting to establish your captive center of excellence. So I think, BOT models might help there, or hiring the right people to get yourself established, I think becomes really important. But I guess the attraction of this is really about building that culture, getting that diversity, having diverse teams, because you get the diversity of thought, which, and Bismarck alluded to this earlier, right? You with that, you can be more innovative, you can be more creative, and develop much stronger solutions. So I think for me, the question becomes is how we do it, and how we do it to ensure success.
Reframe the question a little bit. Do you still think, I'll never forget, we had an article 10, 12 years ago in Nearshore Americas, is like, the perspective of Latin America is the last thing we need is the gung-ho American style of leadership down here. And that resonated quite well. What has changed? Is the confidence right size from the American perspective? Are Americans going in and sort of more realistically understanding how to do this?
I agree with the perception that the American enterprise or corporate America they are more open to nearshore. 15 years ago was more about, Latin America has the right resources. Do they really understand the American culture? Can we do this? And it was more about pilots, testing, basically starting in a small way. Today, the conversation has changed from three aspects, in my perspective. One is about the scale. The conversation is more about how much can I move to nearshore, right? It's not about can nearshore do this, right? Or can I do this in nearshore? The scale is important, and it's not only about IT, with finance, HR, as I mentioned. Other functions that change marketing, digital marketing is a hot one. The second aspect in that conversation is about the ecosystem, right? Where the captive capability center fits in my overall operating model. When do I use outsourcing partners versus internal resources? And how can I create a seamless model to deliver services, taking advantage of nearshore and offshore benefits? So that is the second one. And the third one that we see oftenly is about collaboration and alignment across the C-suite. In early days, 15, 20 years, it was driven by technology, most likely the CIO. Today is driven by CDOs, CIOs, CPOs, you name it. And anyone who has a C title is involved in the conversation. And they want to be part of the design of that global ecosystem. But that's the big change. It's more about how I can do it in nearshore, at what scale, and how easy I can, or how fast I can realize value of that proposition.
How do the second tier set of countries, as we all know, this shouldn't be news to anybody, but Mexico and Colombia are sitting up here and are very commonly looked at as the first option, go-to option for captives. We participate in that perception too, because they're tried and true, big populations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, there's that whole other tier, Jamaica, El Salvador, Ecuador here today, that kind of come up and you say, oh, hold on. Even Panama is an interesting spot. So just for the panel, what does it need to take to break through and get in that top tier?
So I would say the first thing is going to be the education system. Is going to be number one. And then probably the second one, since we're going for locality, would be English proficiency.
What about the old statement, there's smart people everywhere?
There absolutely are.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, we often talk about, and I hear it here, about like, where did you decide to do your nearshoring? And especially if you're working with contractors, you don't have to pick a location. A lot of people will say like, I want somebody, and the answer is, where do you want them? And I'm like,
Same time zone?
Same time zone.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it wound up in Lima, Peru. Well, it wound up in Bogota. It wound up in Mexico or whatever. And so there's a great deal of flexibility. Now, when it comes to kind of what you were asking about, like to get from tier 2 to tier 1, tier 2 works well in those scenarios. You can have people dispersed. But when you start talking about actually like having a center of excellence or whatever, you do often, in particular captive, you do often pick a locality. And so I would say the two things would be education and
Fair enough.
proficiency.
Yeah, I mean, he basically said what I would have said too. It's about English language proficiency. It's about education.
So let me just push back a little bit, not push back, but just make a comment. So Anurag, you started telling me about Guadalajara getting really competitive a couple of years ago. So what happens, as you guys know, is these places you love to go to become very competitive. So what's the long-term viability of that if you've got, more churn, more cost escalation?
I think it's long-term commitment from the ecosystem that you need to be successful in the nearshore industry. So it's having long-term commitment from universities or colleges, right? Long-term commitment from vendors that they will continue developing the right talent services, the government incentives, right? That's important. What we saw was a dip on the interest of moving from America to Mexico in the past 6 years. And who had to pick the ball for the drop ball, all the vendors, right? I see Gustavo here. And you had to do a lot of the PR marketing that typically you had funds from the government. So that's a big gap, right? That you see. What happened? Colombia took the cue and basically start using that gap or using the gap to promote themselves as the next location destination. So for me, I will not call it, I will call it the upcoming destinations. If they figure out and invest in that ecosystem and have the right voice in this type of event, as an example, the name will come out, right? And we will be collectively looking at those locations as an opportunity. And then comes the givens, like, well, talent, skills, I will say value proposition. Now, in terms of the second question about what happened when a location gets basically a lot of demand and price goes up and attrition goes up and all the beautiful things that we don't want to see a lot. What happened is when you have that robust ecosystem in place, you will have I wouldn't say unlimited, but a more vast pool of resources, talent, and resources that you can take advantage, and you can regulate that price point. And we have seen that with Costa Rica, a small country, but they are very relevant in the space. There's still a lot of places and locations where you can tap talent, right? But it requires two things. One is providers to really invest on those locations, right? And then secondly is clients looking, or companies looking and giving the opportunity to develop those regions. And it's like going back in time, right? 25 years ago, Nearshore didn't exist. It was a process of untapping talent, developing talent, building the value proposition. 25 years ago, I worked for GE. We started the Capability Center in Aguascalientes, in Mexico. Who knew about Aguascalientes? Well, people who party because of the feria that exists there. But speaking about technology center, it was like, are you crazy? Why Aguascalientes if you have a large talent pool in Mexico City? And the same is true 20 years ago, or around the same time, Uruguay, Montevideo, small country population, right? Nobody knew about Uruguay unless you were a soccer fan. Now, because of the World Cup, right? But there was a couple of visionaries that they wanted to basically develop the talent, develop the industry, create the industry down there. I think there is a lot of untapped potential, but it requires investment.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll close it out with this. We saw Brazil, as Chris knows well. Brazil was very, very, very active in this market, in Nearshore Nexus, actually, going back 10 years ago. Somehow they're not here. But we can't forget Porto Alegre and Recife and all these places. And you have Mérida, Baja California, Santiago, Dominican Republic. You have a whole bunch of places that we're not talking about as much that we're willing to tell you about, for sure. So anyway, thank you, panel. Well done. Thanks for all the great insights.